All right. Thanks so much for being here today, and thank you, the Center of Excellence, for asking me to be a part of, even though I am a part of the Center of Excellence, but thank you, Pablo. And thanks all of you for being here. I know for some of us, it's quite an early morning. So, and yeah, I hope everybody's staying safe in this time in the world. So I'll be talking a bit about, I would say, my conversation or my talk today is essentially an overview of the center itself. It kind of goes through some of the things that we've been doing here. And I know I don't have the time to get in depth into everything. And so it'll be a lot more of an overview than anything else. However, I do want to highlight and foreground some of the conversations we've been having around how to ethically and equitably incorporate multiple knowledge systems, multiple worldviews when thinking about multifunctional landscapes, when thinking about the future, since a lot of our concerns in our current situation stem from the fact that there are pretty stark issues of justice and equity that still remain both within the process of knowledge production as well as how that knowledge then becomes reality. So my name's Ritodhi Chakraborty and I'm at Lincoln University. Um, so this is a bit of an overview. So I'll do a bit of an introduction, go through some of the research questions, which I hope to address today, give you a bit of an overview of the methods, and then kind of go into review of literature, and then talk about the actual framework, and then talk about how it's being operationalized currently through the center in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then address some of the questions and then conclusions and future work. So again, my past is actually working in the Himalayas. So I worked for many years with small farmers and producers and agrarian transformation across the Himalayan range. And so I came to the rangeland and the pastoral literature and to the rangeland pastoral field after traversing through the highland pastures of the Himalayas, which, as you know, lead into the Tibetan plateau and through that into Mongolia, which probably together constitute one of the biggest grasslands and livestock systems we have on the planet. Um, and this is a map that I've put here, which again, any kind of rendition of the kind of I would say social ecological rangelands we have can have many different variations to it. So this is one of those variations, and it kind of shows you how widespread and how diverse rangelands and pastoral lands are. Um, and so this is one, right? And then two is sort of understanding what are some of these issues that are facing rangelands today. Um, and from where I am sitting, what I see is I'd say like five big issues which jump up at me. The first, of course, is climate change and the way that, as other speakers have talked about, regimes of heat and temperature are changing, fire are changing, uh, things like subsurface temperatures, things like microbacterial activity, things like whole plant functional types, as well as the relationships that foragers and these species have with the plant body, as well as the communities and how they are engaging with these bigger biota. Secondly is management, right? Rangelands are complex, just like any other, I would say, biotic space where they don't quite adhere to, let's say, national borders. They don't quite adhere to what I would call artificial bounding of their abilities or their properties. And therefore, you get these multi-scalar governance systems where, as Dr. Hunsinger quite amazingly put to words, that there are some serious issues of management that come from discrepancies of power across these ranges of governance. And then third is sort of the science policy translation, right? I mean, you have a body of science which, for better or for worse, has been in charge of informing political actions. And the science in itself is rooted in a certain worldview. And therefore, the translation from, let's say, a certain kind of a world to how that world should look like can often not be exactly how it was imagined. And so, addressing some of these science policy issues are also at the forefront of rangeland issues today. Land use, as you know, I mean, I saw it in front of my eyes in the Himalayas, the amount of families that were giving up livestocking, whole herds of yak and of sheep, which used to number in the hundreds and thousands, are now down to, 50 or 60 per family. And a lot of that, the reasons why that is happening is quite complex, right? It ranges from things like education for children, right up to state decided, I would say, zoning, as well as how land is getting passed down from one generation to the next. And then, last but not least, and maybe the issue that I am most interested in is issues of equality and justice. So, for example, if you talk to a lot of Maori stakeholders here, there's a lot of conversations around land that was confiscated, and they don't quite see how the overall, let's say, remuneration and reconciliation has happened, which has addressed that confiscation in its full entirety. Having said that, something like the Treaty of Waitangi then serves as a way ahead. And so, these kind of issues exist all over the world, where there are historical processes that are colonial, that are process of state building that have disenfranchised and marginalized people. And so I would say this is sort of the ground in which we are rooted when it comes to rangeland issues today. And then, secondly, the other, I would say, sphere that I'm engaging with directly is the politics of knowledge. And this relates to how knowledge itself is produced and who gets to decide what is valid knowledge, the assessments of it, the evaluation of it, and then finally, the dissemination of it to a wider audience. And so, within this sphere of, I would say, scholarship and research, there's three big things that come up. One is co-production. So more and more now, often through decades of challenges and, I would call it, rebellion from certain groups, there is the space of who is an expert and who gets to decide what is valid knowledge has finally opened up slightly to allow indigenous people, local producers, farmers, to sit at these tables with so-called people in positions of power, which then allows for knowledge to be produced collaboratively, rather than having a hierarchy in place where experts produce knowledge and then indigenous communities are just given that knowledge. The second thing relates to human nature relationships. And if you look across the world, and I've worked with indigenous communities in 5 different countries, and there is one thing that really springs forth, which is the fact that while in the Western scientific paradigm you have this human nature duality where humans are seen as separate from nature, and often our science and our policy is rooted in this reality almost. You see in indigenous societies there being this boundary being very perforated, right? So people and animals and plants and spirits and ideas and seasons, they're all constantly moving around in this fluid dynamic vortex where it's impossible to draw a very clear line between what is human and what is not. And so these kind of relationships, once they are foregrounded in our science, in our management, completely changes the way we understand what knowledge actually is, right? And so if we have, let's say, a focused effort on preserving ecosystem services, and we think of the ecosystem as being this biophysical entity, then for a lot of indigenous communities, we've really lost our way. Like, that is really not how they are defining that criteria. And then finally, there is this issue of integration, right? In a lot of, I would say, production of knowledge around sustainability, around environmental management, around, let's say, agroecological management, there is this search and this yearning for integration, right? And by itself, I don't think it is bad. By itself, I don't think this prerogative is somehow misplaced. But what is often happening in many of these cases is that people and institutions are sacrificing equality in the search for integration. And this is something which is very insidious, and we have to be very careful when pursuing integration, because we have to be very careful that the price that we are willing to pay is not the price of democracy, because we can't be trying to integrate unless there is equality of power, let's say, within a group of stakeholders. And so these are three of the big issues that I see right now, within the politics of knowledge, and in terms of environmental management or in terms of rangeland management. And so, given the background of these two things, my bigger question here is, how do we redesign rangeland pastoral systems that address the enduring legacies of colonial land management, incorporate risks of climate uncertainty, and engage with diverse stakeholders while enhancing the health and well-being of our social ecological relationships? So yeah, it's a small problem we're dealing with here. However, as you can realize, this is a hyper complex issue. This is and it requires sustained effort over decades to even get at it. So I'll present to you the three questions that I want to address today on this platform. The first one is, how do we create and sustain platforms that address knowledge equity within landscape science and management? Second is, how do we facilitate an engagement between expert-driven scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge that is not exploitative and not extractive? And then finally, how do we operationalize such a framework within a real multi-stakeholder, multifunctional landscape? And again, these questions are not questions that I came up on my own. These questions are questions that arise from a lot of literature review, but also from actually engaging with indigenous communities across the world and here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So what are the methods that I use to address these two questions? The first one is, I did a systematic literature review with Google Scholar Web of Science, ProQuest, and put in some of these keywords that I thought were important, and looked at literature between 2015 and 2020. And then secondly are the case studies, which is essentially the work that we are doing at the Center for Excellence at Lincoln University. And so the the process, I have it here on the screen as a bit of a review, a conceptualization, an operationalization, and then we sort of go back to review again, because these processes are deeply iterative, and as such they refer to the way knowledge is actually produced, right? We don't get to a point of time where our knowledge somehow is static and now we've answered the question. It's more of a dynamic, fluid, a living kind of a knowledge, which is changed and transforms with the needs of the people that are actually working on it. So again, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but some of the insights that come up when you do a review of literature, some of the theories that are at the heart of some of the rangeland and pastoral science and management today. You go from things like common property resource management, which have heavy roots in economic theory, to rangeland ecology, systems theory, political ecology and governance, which is actually my specialization, complex adaptive systems, and climate change adaptations. And again, with the reason I've put this on the screen is to give you a sense of the wide spectrum of I would say ideas and concepts that are informing the sphere of rangeland science. Because often I would say people that are not inside the scientific establishment look at science as being this unified body. But that's not the case at all. Because if you see here, just in the review of literature, imagine the amount of dissonance and the amount of divergence there could be just within one scientific process. Um, and so three of the things that emerge from the review of literature is that, as I kind of maybe alluded to earlier, is that there is there's quite a few issues around governance, which allude to things again like how resources are managed, who has autonomy, how we should be planning our landscapes, to ideas of scale, right? Because often nation states, let's say, are creating rangeland models that are on a national scale. However, the impacts of it, let's say on a herder scale or on a village scale or on a region scale, are completely different, right? And scales tend to be biased towards certain agendas, right? And so if I am getting at it from a catchment scale, then the kind of zoning or the kind of landscape policy I will produce will be trying to manage things at that catchment scale. However, that doesn't quite address the issues that people are experiencing on a household scale. And so it's very important that you understand that this is a key issue right now in understanding how to deal with rangelands and pastorals, is this idea of scale. And then finally, knowledge, right, which is what a lot of this talk is going to be about, is sort of understanding how some of this knowledge comes about, who gets to decide, how it is evaluated. And across the world, in right from, let's say, climate change knowledge to environmental knowledge, economic systems, anything that you see, there is a marginalization of indigenous knowledge. There is a marginalization of ideas that are so-called non-expert. And so addressing this politics of knowledge, addressing this, I would almost call it power hierarchy, becomes critical if we are to have any kind of way ahead. And so, again, I think I talked about some of this just now, the politics of knowledge. These are some of the key issues that emerge from that. Is how are we evaluating processes and outcomes within our knowledge, let's say, production? How are we incorporating multiple worldviews, right? And so this isn't just transdisciplinarity. This isn't just a geographer talking to a biologist. Because let's say if both of us are rooted in the same Western science paradigm, then we are still, operating within a singular worldview. When I say multiple worldviews, what I mean is when I'm working with herders in Masai Mara, the world they see is actually different. I mean, and this is not a narrative about the world. The actual world they see is different. And so incorporating that within our planning and our science is of critical importance. And then this issue of trans, inter, and multidisciplinarity, like how do we create knowledge that addresses each of these issues again in an equitable way and in a way that is functional, right? And then finally, this question of integration versus pluralism, right? Are we searching for this elusive thing of integration at all costs, and in the process sacrificing the very thing that allows our systems to function, which is our diversity? So this is the plural knowledges framework that I came up with. And again, what I want to say to you is that this isn't by itself some kind of path-breaking invention. This stands on the shoulders of hundreds of people that have done work like this across the world with indigenous communities, with local producers, trying to create systems that are actually equitable and just. And again, we don't have the time right now today to kind of go into the nitty gritty of how this actually works, but I'll, sort of go over it quite fast so you get an understanding. So what is the plural knowledges framework? It is a processual framework that addresses the issues of equity within analytical attempts at engaging with multiple worldviews, right? And the framework is focused on a parallel analytical pathways and draws on its definitions from the voluminous existing research on participatory management of natural resources, indigenous governance, social ecological systems, and environmental justice. And so, unlike, let's say, frameworks that are based on a case study, we are actually based in, let's say, consensus building with indigenous people. In this framework is actually based in the literature review, is based in work that has already been done all over the world. So these are the four pieces of the actual framework: consensus, methods and tool creation, analytical pathway, and implementation. And so currently in the center, we are in that analytical pathway bit and going more towards the implementation. However, each of these pieces requires a very separate set of, I would say, engagement, a very separate set of understandings, a very separate set of stakeholders, and how we do that again is not something I can go into right now. But just to give you a sense that this is the processual framework. And so I would say there's four salient features in the framework that I want to leave you with. Um, the first is that we are defining these different worldviews. If you see here, there's three different worldviews on the screen. There's the relational here, constituent here, and Maturanga Maori. And so the one of the questions you can ask is, oh, but why are you saying Maturanga Maori and not indigenous knowledge? The reason we're saying that is because we're making a strategic and a political point here, which is indigenous knowledge is place-based, right? There is no universal indigenous knowledge. And because of that, since our framework was developed in collaboration with Maori practitioners and reflects the realities of this land, we have chosen to actually term it Maturanga Maori because it is rooted in the Maturanga, which is the Maori knowledge base. And the reason we define these three things this way, again, is it comes from literature. The relational worldview comes from critical social science and humanities research, where people think of the world as, these assemblages, these relationships that can't be broken down into quantitative boxes. The second, the constituent one, which is one that a lot of biophysical scientists work with, is rooted in the Cartesian and the Newtonian version of the world, where you can actually quantify and break down things to fully understand, how reality actually works. So that's salient point one, right? Then the next thing is process categories, right? So let's say the production of knowledge, it deals with empirical, analytical, and representational aspects. Now, what does that mean? Empirical is the actual pieces of data, right? That could be an oral history session, that could be let's say, measurement of soil microbial activity, and which then is sort of the I would say the noun here, right? This is the piece of data that you can put inside a machine to then analyze it. So the second is analytical, which is essentially how you would actually just disseminate and think about all these kinds of data. And finally is representational, which is how you would take all what you've got, your conclusions, and then present it in a certain way. Now, if you look across the world, wherever we've had collaborations with indigenous communities, the analytical piece is the one that's the weakest, right? Because often people can take something like an oral history or something like an ethnographic work history and then put that through a statistical model. In a sense, going against the very paradigm that produced it, right? So if we are to have true, I would call it in co-production of knowledge, then analytical justice, which is basically the fact that a piece of knowledge that is produced within a certain worldview has to be analyzed by the rules of that worldview, right? This has to be actively pursued. The third part here is identifying evaluation and assessment parameters. This is, again, a huge issue in many, I would call it, processes of knowledge production, that using something like the SDGs or using something like, I would say, the sustainable farming framework or what have you, can often be quite limiting when we are doing this kind of work. And then finally, scales and temporalities. I think I'm running out of time here, so I'll run through some of the things. This is sort of the, kind of taking this framework and putting it on the New Zealand context. And so Pablo, I know, has already talked about the Center for Excellence. And then again, I don't think I have enough time to get inside the actual work that we are doing on the ground, but I would be happy to get into that if we have more time in the, during the questions.
Yeah, we should be able to sort of ask some questions in the discussion room and hear a little bit more about what you guys are up to.